Hey folks, welcome to Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty, third edition, chapter 16, America's Gilded Age, 1870 to 1890, from Mr. Wilkins' AP US History class at Aurora West. This will be a brief overview of everything that's covered in this chapter. This will not contain as much detail as you can get in the chapter, so you definitely want to read that, but this will help you review and prepare for what's in that chapter. So let's get going. So this was a time period that was known as the Gilded Age, but was also known as the Second Industrial Revolution. And this is because this was a time period that saw the United States become the industrial power of the world. In fact, by 1913, the United States was making 1/3 of the world's industrial output: steel, railroads, oil, everything that is involved in industry. The United States was making it. This is more than Great Britain, more than France, more than Germany combined. That's an amazing amount. This was a time period that would also see a major shift in the workforce. Workers were going to be moving from farms to cities, and in those cities, they were going to be working in factories. We're also going to see a sharp increase in immigration. In fact, 25 million immigrants are going to make their way to the United States, most of them from Europe, but also some from Asia and from South America. To the United States in this time period and provide workers and consumers in the United States. And it's going to also diversify the culture and politics of the United States. Cities around the Great Lakes in the United States, cities like Chicago and Buffalo and Cleveland and Detroit, are going to see the greatest amount of growth during this time period because a lot of factories are located there. So why? Why was the United States becoming the industrial power of the world? Multiple reasons. First of all, natural resources. The United States had so many natural resources that they started tapping into and using during this time period. Also, with the combination of immigration and a high birth rate, the United States had a growing labor supply. Also, with people moving from farms to cities to work in factories, that's a growing labor supply. We had expanding markets too, because the United States was expanding west and reaching out to trade with other countries. And we had a lot of investment capital. We had a lot of money and people who had that money who wanted to invest it into business so they could make more money and make businesses grow. The United States also had tremendous government support. The United States federal government put a lot of money, put a lot of time and other benefits into these industries and into seeing the economy grow. One of the key reasons for the growth of the United States was railroads. Railroads were a key part, if not the reason why the United States grew so quickly. Between 1860 and 1890, railroad mileage in the United States tripled, and it tripled again by 1920. In 1869, the United States completed its first transcontinental railroad. That means it's a railroad that crossed the continent. So you could ride from the East Coast to the West Coast, or from the West Coast to the East Coast without having to switch trains. There were 5 of these transcontinental railroads by the 1890s. And the creation of the railroads and these transcontinental railroads created national markets for goods. This meant that you could have farmers and factories that would produce goods that could then ship them easily to the other side of the country. You had companies that based their business model on this. Mail order companies like Montgomery Ward and Sears would be located in cities, but then would send these catalogs in the mail all over the country, and people living in rural areas could order these goods from their companies. Other innovations that would forever change the world emerged during this time. The transatlantic cable connected Europe with the United States so that we could send telegraph signals between Europe and the United States. So messages were being sent more quickly. This was soon replaced by telephones. Telephones began to emerge all across the United States and then around the world. The typewriter made it easier to print, to write letters, and the handheld cameras became useful. So well before you had your phones to take pictures, we had handheld cameras. One of the key figures in all this was Thomas Edison, a genius inventor. Really, he was a genius inventor and also a genius businessman. He knew how to market his inventions. He's known for the light bulb, the electric generating station that allowed for cities to be lit up at night, and for sound and motion capture. So you would not be able to listen to music on your phone or watch any videos without the inventions of Thomas Edison. This was a time period that saw a lot of competition between businesses, but also saw a lot of consolidation or businesses merging with each other. So the growth of major businesses in the United States led to cutthroat practices. For instance, you had pools that would be formed or trusts that would form to fix prices and limit competition. Pools and trusts are different forms that big businesses can take to try to limit competition, to drive any competitors out. Many fields were dominated by one company. For instance, U.S. Steel dominated the steel industry, Standard Oil, the oil industry, International Harvester cornered the production of farming tools, mechanized farming tools. One of the most prominent figures, Andrew Carnegie, was the founder of U.S. Steel, and he used something known as vertical integration in the steel industry. That means that to produce steel, he controlled every level of production. He controlled the land where the iron ore that was needed was produced. He controlled the railroad lines that carried that iron ore to the factories. He controlled where the steel was sold. He controlled every single step along the way. Then you had John D. Rockefeller, who is pictured on the left here in a cartoon uh, in a cartoon that is not too complimentary of him. He used something known as horizontal integration to create an oil monopoly for oil refining. So those are what the stacks are up here. So what he did was he did not control the land where the oil was found, uh, but he did control the refinery where you took that raw oil and you basically made it into a product that could be used. So if you wanted to get that oil refined, you had to go to John D. Rockefeller, basically. He also made deals with railroads, as signified in these in the cartoons, and to give him lower prices to ship the oil. And he also drove out or bought out any competitors. If you tried to compete with him, he would lower his prices until you were driven out of business. By the 1880s, he controlled 90%, over 90% of the oil industry in the United States. Now, some folks would call them captains of industry, as in they were leading the way in their industrial fields. Others would call them robber barons, simply taking advantage of the poor and making themselves rich off the labor of others. And we'll debate this in class. But you can't argue that by 1890, the richest 1%, people like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, they had as much as the bottom half of the US population. So, what about the workers? Well, wealth distribution in the United States was widely uneven during this time period. The majority of laborers saw low wages and frequent unemployment. Men would often work in factories, and women would work as well, either in factories or as domestic workers, as maids, as taking care of children in higher income households. But during this time period, from 1880 to 1890, over 35,000 died annually from workplace accidents. Again, that's 35,000 dying annually from workplace accidents. And there's this idea of liberty of contract, this idea that every man and woman would work for himself, and that businesses should treat workers individually. And the Supreme Court agreed with this. In fact, Supreme Court decisions struck down numerous state regulations and laws that would try to restrict businesses. The Supreme Court basically was supporting the idea of laissez-faire. That's a French term that means let it be or let it go. This idea that business and the economy should work on its own without government interference. So as a response, you're going to see the rise of organized labor or labor unions during this time period. This begins with strikes, where workers on the railroads would go on strike in 1877. This was known as the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. This started over the Atlantic coast in Maryland, in Baltimore, and quickly spread west and lasted for several months. And then you had labor unions formed, like the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor sought to unify a diverse range of workers, skilled workers and unskilled workers, men and women, different races, to try and organize and strengthen the rights of laborers. The Knights of Labor are going to peak with an incident known as the Haymarket Affair that takes place in 1886. And we'll take a closer look at this in class. But the Haymarket Affair is not going to work out well for the Knights of Labor and other unions. And so we're going to see a slight regress in union strength and participation. Meanwhile, this is a time period of great social change and growth in cities. With the rise of cities, of course, comes the rise of crime and poverty. I shouldn't say of course, but with the rise of cities came a rise in crime and poverty because nobody had really seen cities this big in the United States before, and they weren't sure what to do with these issues. Well, what do you do about rising crime and poverty? Well, there was one line of thinking called social Darwinism that basically said, don't do anything. It's survival of the fittest. If you can survive, great. If you can't, well, that's just nature. You were supposed to pass on anyway. Others, though, advocated for something known as the social gospel. And this was the idea that churches must help the needy, must help the poor, must help the immigrants, and do what they can to provide for the less, for those who have less. Well, what about economic and social inequality? Well, some people proposed high taxes on real estate. Some people proposed changing up the system in the United States and advocated for things like socialism. Others pushed for things like peaceful upheaval. And they spread their ideas through books like Progress and Poverty or Looking Backward that promoted ideas that would radically change society. Meanwhile, while all this transformation is going on in the cities with immigration and rise of industry, the Western United States is also radically transforming. Western migration has always been a constant in the United States. This has always gone on. From the first European settlers, European colonizers to arrive, people have always been moving west. Uh, and this would increase in the after the Civil War. And one argument came from this guy named Frederick Jackson Turner. And he wrote a thesis paper called Significance of the Frontier in American History. And it came out in 1890. And Turner argued that the West was a safety valve, that people would go out there and this would release tension in the rest of the United States and give people opportunity. However, Turner, it should be noted, ignored the fact that you had thousands of natives who lived out in the West. You had slaves who had been forced to move out west before the Civil War. And you had other people who lived out west already. So it's not like the Americans were moving west into some uninhabited paradise. Well, anyway, people moved west. And the West in the United States, as we know, living in Colorado, it is an incredibly geographically diverse place. There are plains, there are mountains, there are deserts, there's coastline. So to say the West, it is to describe a very diverse place. One thing that motivated a lot of people to move west was something known as the Homestead Act, passed in 1862, signed by Abraham Lincoln during the middle of the Civil War. And this encouraged farmers to move west. It provided them cheap land. And if they could improve, they basically would get it for free. So great opportunity for people who had nothing left to lose out in the East. And there were other government policies that encouraged land speculation, so people to buy up land and think they could get rich selling it. And the government basically gave away free land to railroads. Both the federal government and state governments gave land away to railroads, hoping that the railroads would build and thus bring more people and bring more access to markets and improve living in those states. And of course, lots of farmers lived out west. But this was hard living. Being a farmer is not easy. A lot of wheat and corn were grown in places like Minnesota, Kansas, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska. Most of the farmers at the beginning were small, independent. You had some bonanzas or a combination of small farms that would try and grow one crop and make a lot of money. However, as a farmer, prices of crops were in constant flux on national and international markets. So you were never sure each year what your crops would sell for, what price. You also had cowboys and ranchers who lived out west. You had cattle drives that went from Texas to Kansas to the rail lines that were in Kansas in cities like Abilene that would then ship the cattle to places like Chicago to provide beef for the East Coast. Eventually, these cattle drives would end because of barbed wire, because of things like blizzards, and because of railroad expansion. Corporations, though, would quickly gain control of the land and resources in the West through things like mining, controlling the railroads, purchasing land with lumber, and finding land that had a lot of oil underneath it. They also took over farms and created commercial farms and ranches that focused on providing just more and more goods, more and more food for people across the United States, and that would drive small farms and small ranches out of business. Farmers would push back, though. And they would form organizations like the Grange and things called co-ops, not coops, but co-ops that would fight for railroad regulation and price controls. And eventually, they would influence groups like the Farmers Alliance and the Populist Party. to push for laws that would support farmers and ranchers. As I mentioned before, Native Americans had resided in the West for thousands of years, and this migration, this increase in migration out west, is going to create conflict because many Native Americans called the Great Plains home. The Great Plains is the area in the central United States, Kansas, part of Minnesota, eastern Colorado, where we are, Nebraska, and the Dakotas would all fall under the Great Plains area. This included tribes like the Cheyenne, Comanche, the Crow, Kiowa, and the Sioux. And the Native Americans in this area were known for their hunting buffalo by horseback. And as westward migration it continues, there's going to be an increase in bloodshed. General Philip Sheridan, who was a hero in the Civil War, is going to target villages and target the buffalo. So he's not going to take the Native Americans head on. He's not going to fight their warriors. He's going to target their villages. He's going to target the buffalo and really hit them where it hurts. In fact, the buffalo is going to be devastating. Buffalo are going to be reduced from about 30 million in 1800 to less than 1,000 by 1890. They almost went extinct. And the Indians were forced onto reservations, which was land that was much less desirable. It was difficult to hunt, it was difficult to farm. And plus, for a lot of these Native American tribes, they were used to living where they wanted to live, and now they're being forced to live on these reservations. Now, there will be resistance. Leaders like Sitting Bull, who's pictured to the left, Crazy Horse, would help lead the Sioux in fighting back against being forced onto reservations and changing their lives. Cochise and Geronimo would be Apache leaders, and every tribe had leaders who would either peacefully or violently push back against the United States, driving them from their land and forcing them to change their cultures. There were some victories for the Native Americans, like Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. However, the military defeat would come because the United States simply had too many resources to take on the Native Americans. And the military defeat would be complete with the Wounded Knee Massacre that took place in 1890 in the Dakotas. And by this time period, there were about 250,000 Native Americans who remained in the United States. So we go from possibly millions of Native Americans when the first Europeans came here to about 250,000 in 1890. And it wasn't just forcing Native Americans onto reservations, it was remaking them as people. So the treaty system that the United States used to have was replaced by the reservation system. And this was a way that the United States sought to transform and basically destroy Native culture. They did things like created boarding schools that would assimilate Indian children and force them to learn English and American traditions, made them convert to Christianity and basically ignore their native culture and native languages. And then you had laws like the Dawes Act of 1887 that broke up reservation land. And the intent of this was to convert Native Americans to farming, to, again, what were considered American ways of life. Most of this land, though, was purchased by land speculators and by railroads. In fact, natives lost 86 million of the 138 million acres that were provided for Native Americans under the Dawes Act. When it came to citizenship, even though Native Americans were Native Americans, the Supreme Court ruled that the 14th and 15th Amendment that concerned citizenship and the right to vote did not apply to Native Americans. Eventually, Native Americans would be granted total citizenship by Congress in 1924. Let's take a look at politics in the Gilded Age. Now, the United States during this time period was more democratic than other countries. However, lobbyists wielded influence over state and local governments. Lobbyists were people who represented certain businesses or certain people who tried to influence politicians to pass laws that would benefit their business or themselves. You had groups known as political machines that would control cities. Groups like Tammany Hall, led by Boss Tweed, sorry, not Boss Weed, but Boss Tweed. In fact, this cartoon on the left is a cartoon of Boss Tweed. And they basically ran the show in New York City. This resulted in many scandals, like the Credit Mobilier scandal and the Whiskey Ring scandal that affected the federal government. And there were numerous scandals at the state and local level as well. And the Civil War divisions that we'd seen between North and South, Yankees and Confederates, was going to continue to influence the divisions between Republicans and Democrats in the parties and elections during the Gilded Age. Republicans, though, it should be noted, dominated national politics for most of the era, While there were some Democratic presidents, the Republican Party, for the most part, controlled the federal government. However, Democrats did control a lot of local and state governments. There were several important reforms that should be noted during this time period, such as the Civil Service Act that actually required many people working in the federal government to actually be qualified for their jobs. You had the Interstate Commerce Commission, which was an early step in trying to regulate railroads in the United States, and the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was a big first step in trying to break up big businesses and create more opportunities for competition during this time period. Well, thanks for watching. The next period, we're going to take a look at the United States continuing to grow during the Gilded Age, but also begin to expand its influence overseas.